Okay. Hey guys.
Flashlight. Switch
We're gonna
button.
start off.
Select Mr. Ballin. Heading.
Yes.
Cast.
Scary
Female Hannibal
memories.
Lecter given harshest sentence. Learn more about learn uploads. Russia's most feared criminal. Speech
Yeah, we're
off.
gonna watch some of these videos of 3. Okay. Okay, let's start. And guys, let me tell you, don't judge.
Video player. Vertical scroll bar. Video player. Video player. Vertical video player. Select video selected. Speech off.
Thank you.
Today's story sounds exactly like an urban legend. It sounds too exaggerated, too grotesque, too terrifying to be real. But it is. This is the true story of the Bitsevsky Park maniac. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to help build the Like Button's new dresser they just got from IKEA, and as soon as you open it up, immediately find all the screws, strip them all, and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story.
I know him. I've been watching him for a while. Let me get relaxed under the blanket. I'm gonna watch this scary story. I'm scared.
Moscow, Russia, which is one of the world's richest cities, is home to more billionaires than any other European city. But if you travel just 10 miles south of Moscow's richest neighborhood, the Golden Mile, you will reach one of Russia's poorest neighborhoods, the southern Moscow suburbs. Nicknamed Zhopamira, which means the asshole of the world, these suburbs used to be a thriving neighborhood with tens of thousands of working-class Russians and their families calling it their home. But after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the money and the jobs in this area dried up completely, and even though the residents wanted to relocate and live somewhere with more opportunity, they couldn't. They didn't have the resources to leave, and so they were trapped. And since 1991, really nothing has changed in these suburbs. Today, there are still tens of thousands of now very poor Russian families that still live there, living in these totally overcrowded Soviet apartment buildings that are these big, square, identical-looking things that are literally falling apart. And most of the people who live in these suburbs either are unemployed or they work some dead-end job that barely pays them any money. The police in the suburbs are completely underfunded and, for the most part, are corrupt. And so crime over the years has really taken a dramatic uptick. Also, drug and alcohol abuse are completely running rampant in this part of the world. But despite their notoriously rough living situation in the southern Moscow suburbs, these residents do have one claim to fame, and that is the Bitsevsky Park. Bitsevsky Park is comprised primarily of a massive, lush green forest that is full of wildlife and beautiful streams and clearings, and it sits right on the southern edge of the southern Moscow suburbs. In total, the park covers a whopping 2,700 acres and stretches 4 miles from top to bottom, which makes it 3 times bigger than New York City's famous Central Park. Bitsevsky Park had always been a popular tourist destination for people living around Moscow, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, the park's popularity skyrocketed, specifically amongst people that lived in the southern Moscow suburbs. As their lives continued to become more bleak in the 1990s, they compensated by going to the park as much as they possibly could. They would take long walks in the woods, they would play chess with their friends along the peripheries on the park benches and tables, or they'd go cross-country skiing in the winter. Basically, year-round, this park became their escape from their miserable everyday lives. But that would not last. Starting in the early 2000s,
Guys, this is how you know something bad is about to happen.
Something totally unexplainable and terrifying began happening in the park, specifically in the heavily forested area in the park. And eventually, this unusual event that was taking place got so completely out of hand that the residents of the southern Moscow suburbs stopped going in the park.
Wow. Hey guys, I'm gonna check something real quick.
Speech on. More action. More actions. Button. Blind.
Huh.
Screen recording in progress.
Great.
App. YouTube.
I didn't know it
YouTube.
glitched for a
Video
moment.
player. Track video play. Adlib. Track video play.
Come
Button.
on, I gotta play.
Speech
Okay.
off.
Let's see it.
They were literally too scared to go inside. The strange phenomenon began in 2001. From May to July that year, 10 people went missing after having been spotted either in or right around the outside of the heavily forested area inside of Bitsebsky Park. All of them were alone when they were last spotted.
That's scary.
And all of them were men.
To
Now,
think
there
about.
was some precedent for people suddenly going missing in this part of Russia. Every now and again, people would try to flee these suburbs to try to make a better life for themselves somewhere else. But time and time again, they would just come back a couple of days or weeks later because it hadn't worked out. But when these 10 men did not come back in a couple of days or weeks, their families went to police and reported them missing. But unsurprisingly, the police did not launch an investigation. Instead, they accused the 10 missing men of just being drunk bums who probably wandered off somewhere, and whatever trouble they were in, it was their fault. Now, the families and the locals did not buy this explanation, but there really wasn't
That
a
is
better
crazy.
explanation. These men really had just kind of vanished. No one had any idea where they went. And so given the kind of general grim outlook on life that lots of people held in this area, people just kind of accepted that whatever happened to these 10 men happened and there's nothing any of us can do about it. And they moved on. But in October of that year, so 2 months after the 10th man had gone missing in the park, another man went missing in the park. And then by the end of the year, 4 more men had vanished inside of the park. And all of them vanished
50?
under the same circumstances. Last spotted alone in or around the heavily forested area in the park. The families of these 5 men would go to police. They would report their family members missing. But again, the police did not launch any investigation and blamed the missing people for being responsible for whatever happened to them. And then after that, the families kind of mourned the loss of these 5 men, not really sure what to make of it. And locals kind of gossiped about it for a little while and started to speculate about what might have happened to them and kind of lumped them in with the 10 other men that had gone missing. But after a while, when no new news came out about what happened to them, everyone just kind of moved on again. And unbelievably, this pattern would repeat itself for nearly 4 years. From 2002 to late 2005, 25 more people would go missing inside of Bitsebsky Park. 24 of them would be men, 1 of them would be a woman, although it wasn't clear if she was actually in the same category as the other 24 men, but regardless, that put the total number of mysterious disappearances inside of this forested area in the park up to
creepy.
40. But still, the police shrugged it off, and eventually, so too did the local population. Everyone just kind of moved on, like this phenomenon wasn't happening, that people were not going missing in droves inside of this forest. But everything would change with missing person number 41. Because unlike the previous 40, this missing person would be found again. 63-year-old Nikolai Zakharchenko was a retired police officer who lived in a tiny apartment in the southern Moscow suburbs with his family. He was a classic Russian tough guy who chain-smoked cigarettes and drank lots of vodka. And even though he was well aware of the missing person phenomenon inside of this park, that wasn't about to stop him from doing the thing he loved, which was going on walks inside of this park. He figured whatever was out there, he could handle it. So one evening in November of 2005, Nikolai told his sister that he was going to go out for a walk in the park. But that night, he didn't come back, and so his family was very worried about him, but they decided they would wait until the next morning to see if maybe he showed up. But the following morning, when Nikolai did not show up, his family went to the police. But per usual, the police did nothing. A few days later, a local was walking fairly deep inside of the forest inside of Bitsebsky Park when they noticed well off the trail, off to the left side, there was something unusual kind of tucked in the underbrush. Now, this local was all alone. They had kind of a bad feeling about whatever this was. And so they called the police and they reported seeing something strange. And surprisingly, the police did actually come out and they went over to investigate, and they found this unusual
Notion still continues to be the easiest way to just get information centralized somewhere and then shot out to somewhere else. And for us, that's extremely important because half our team is remote.
Speech on. Video player. Selected. Skip. Speech
Sorry.
off.
thing was Nikolai Zakharchenko. He was lying face down, he was fully clothed, and he only had one injury, but it obviously had been fatal. He had a massive hole on the back of his head. This was not from a gunshot. This was from massive blunt force trauma. He had been struck so hard that literally the back half of his skull was blown clear off. The police searched the area in hopes they might find the murder weapon or some other clue as to what happened to him, but there was nothing. And so all the police could deduce was that Nikolai had obviously been attacked either by a person or group of people or even an animal, and that whoever his attacker was or whatever his attacker was had clearly snuck up on him given the location of his injury. Now that the police had a body and it likely looked like it was a murder, they could no longer ignore the fact that so many people had gone missing inside of this park, and it was looking like probably if they looked around the park, they might find more bodies. So the local police called in reinforcements from Russia's Criminal Investigation Department, and they came to the southern Moscow suburbs, and with the local police, they began searching every inch of this park, looking for more bodies, or just for any indication of who or what was behind this attack and behind all these missing people. But after several days of a very extensive search, where they looked everywhere in this park, all over the forested area, they found nothing. At the same time this huge police search was going down inside of Bitsevsky Park, news about Nikolai's death had spread amongst the southern Moscow suburbs, and people were now getting really scared. Before, the fear of the park felt kind of theoretical because there were no bodies. And so even though it seemed far-fetched, it did seem possible that maybe all these people were getting lost on their own, that they really were just drunks stumbling off. But now, with the discovery that one of these missing people had been horrifically killed, that made the danger associated with this park feel very real. And so it was around this time that most residents of these suburbs stopped going inside of this park in fear of whatever was out there in the forest. And they would forbid their children from going in, and they would tell their neighbors, don't go in the park. And they gave this evil thing that lurked in the forest that caused men to disappear and attacked Nikolai, they gave this thing a name. They called it the Bitsevsky Park Maniac. But despite the fear of this maniac causing so many people to avoid this park, and despite the massive police presence that was in the park constantly looking for bodies, looking for clues, and just generally patrolling the area, despite all that, people still continued to go missing in this park. Starting just a week after the discovery of Nikolai's body in November of 2005, all the way up to April of 2006, 9 more men would mysteriously vanish in the forested section of Bitsevsky Park. And just like Nikolai, just a couple of days after they were reported missing by their families, they would be found lying out in the middle of the park with the backs of their heads caved in. But unlike Nikolai, most of these 9 victims had been found with a glass bottle jammed into the hole in the back of their head, meaning almost certainly this was the work of a human, not some animal. By this point, almost no one was stepping foot inside of the park because it was basically common knowledge that, a serial killer is obviously on the loose in the forest. But despite this, there were still some very stubborn people who continued to go inside of the park. And one of those people was 32-year-old Alexander Pachuchin. He had been born in the southern Moscow suburbs, and he still lived with his family in the same tiny apartment he had grown up in. It's safe to say Alexander's life had been more difficult than his peers. When he was just 4 years old, he fell backwards off of a swing, and when he sat up, he was okay, but the swing came swinging back and smashed him in the front of the head, causing brain damage. Now, his family did not have the money to send him to a hospital, and so when he stood up after getting struck and he was kind of able to walk around and he seemed okay, they determined he was fine and they didn't follow up. But Alexander was not fine. The injury had impaired his cognitive
That's
abilities,
sad.
and years later, when he went to school, the other kids would bully him for sounding dumb. By the time Alexander was in high school, he felt like an outcast. He didn't have any friends, and he was miserable. But his grandfather, who lived in the same apartment complex as he did, he noticed this about Alexander, and he decided he would take him under his wing and he would look after him. And so the first thing he did is he asked Alexander to come over, and he taught him how to play chess, believing that would be something they could bond over. And when he taught Alexander the rules of this game, which are quite complicated, it was like it opened up the secret portion of Alexander's brain that had never been opened before. Alexander immediately absorbed all this information about chess and became a master of it practically overnight. Within a couple of days of being taught how to play, he was beating his grandfather virtually every time they played together.
That's
so his
cool.
grandfather was totally thrilled about this and was very proud of Alexander. And so he decided to bring Alexander down to Bitsevsky Park, where all these old men who were total chess masters were always playing chess on all of the park benches and tables. And so he brought Alexander down there and he put him up against all of these incredible players. And very quickly, Alexander was wiping the floor with them. And they loved him for it. He was their star. He was their prodigy. They totally adored him and they respected him. And when they found out he was getting bullied at school, they made a point of telling him that he would always have a place with them in this park. And so for Alexander, this was like the best moment of his life. He finally felt like he was accepted and he finally felt happy. And so over the years, even after Alexander's grandfather passed away, Alexander continued to go down to Bitsevsky Park to play chess virtually every day. And he kept going to the park to play chess, even when men began going missing in the park, including some of the men he played chess with. And Alexander continued going to the park to play chess, even after bodies began piling up in the park. Alexander's mother was terrified for him and felt like he didn't understand the risk he was putting himself in by going to this park all the time. But every time she pleaded with him not to go, just take one day off from playing chess, Alexander would say, "Mom, I'm gonna be fine." And then he would leave anyways. In April of 2006, Alexander was 32 years old and worked for a local grocery store stocking shelves. By this point, at least 50 people had vanished mysteriously in the forested section of the
that's
park,
too much. Alex, you
and
better listen.
10 bodies had been found. On the morning of the 12th of that month, Alexander showed up to the grocery store for his shift, and right away he noticed there was a new employee. It was this beautiful older woman he had never seen before, and Alexander, while he was confident playing chess, was not remotely confident around women. He had never had a girlfriend before. But he found himself looking at this woman across the store, feeling like she was different, that she was more approachable than other women. And so he told himself that day he was going to go up to her and he was going to say hi. And so all through his shift, he kind of awkwardly watched this woman from a distance, kind of building up his confidence. And then at the end of his shift, her shift was also ending, the pair walked outside at the same time, and Alexander was about to say something, but he just couldn't find his voice. And then he noticed this woman had put a cigarette in her mouth, but she was fishing around for her lighter, like she couldn't find it. And so Alexander jumped into action and pulled his own lighter out, and he held it out to her and said, "Hey, can I light your cigarette?" And so before long, the two were chatting and they were walking together and smoking their cigarettes. And over the course of their conversation, Alexander would learn this woman was named Larissa Koligina, and she was 48 years old, and she lived near Alexander's apartment. And so after they walked for a little while, they arrived in front of her apartment building, and at this point, Alexander knows she's about to go inside, and so he suddenly feels bold, and he asks Larissa, "Hey, do you want to continue walking around with me for a bit and maybe do a pass through the park?" Now, at this point, the Bitsevsky Park was totally not a place you would bring people to. This is a place that everyone in the area is basically terrified of. But for Alexander, Bitsevsky Park was like his happy place. And so naturally, if he's going to take a woman on a date, that's where he's going to bring her.
Well,
and surprisingly, Larissa was very quick to say, "Oh, let's go to the park."
Larissa. You know, I feel like, I don't know why. I just think she's the killer, but I can't say. It just, she's suspicious. Why would you say it? I don't think they know. I can't say anything. Let's just continue.
And so the two, they lit up another cigarette and they walked across the road and they walked through the front gates of the park. Their first stop was the chess tables along the periphery of the park, right outside of the forest, and the tables were totally empty. But at this point, that wasn't surprising given the fact that even amongst diehard chess players, really Alexander was the only one still willing to go back in there every single day. And so after seeing where Alexander spent all of his time, it seemed like it was time to turn around and leave. But neither Alexander nor Larissa wanted their date to end, and so they decided to light up another cigarette and then follow a walking path that kind of looped into the forest and came back out again. And as they entered the woods and got deeper and deeper into the forest, the chess tables that were behind them faded from view, and the sky began to get darker and darker as it was getting late. But the pair just kept on walking, maintaining their cheerful conversation. But at some point, as they talked and walked, the path below their feet stopped looking like the path they had originally set out on. Now they're stepping over broken logs and they're ducking under low-hanging branches, and it's not really clear if they're on a marked trail anymore. But neither of them bring it up. They just maintain their kind of light conversation and continue walking as if nothing's going on.
Okay.
However, they both definitely began walking faster and faster to maybe speed up this loop. But at some point, when it was very obvious they were no longer on a path, they both came to a stop. As they had walked, Alexander had been in front, and so when they came to a stop, he turned around and he looked at Larissa.
Here's how to cancel a subscription with Truebill. Open the app,
Oh my god!
go to the Recurring tab, and here you can see
Video
a
player.
calendar of
True.
all your upcoming
Video player.
charges.
Selected. Skip at. Speech off.
Right away, he could tell there was just something wrong about her. There was a look on her face that just didn't look right. She looked exhausted or sad or something. And then as he's looking at her, she inexplicably kind of collapses into a tree right next to her, and she grabs the tree with her arms and she slides down to its base, and she presses her cheek and her chest up against its bark, and she begins to cry. Alexander has no idea what's going on, so he just stands there staring at her. And in between sobs, Larissa looks up at Alexander and says, "You're the maniac, aren't you?" Alexander couldn't believe it. She was the first person to figure it out so quickly.
What?
Normally, he would have to tell his victims before he killed them. And so he smirked and he looked at her and he said, "Yes, I am." And so Larissa, at this point, she lets out this huge sob and she looks down and she keeps crying. And then she looks back up again at him and she says, "Are you going to kill me?" And without any hesitation, Alexander looks at her and he says, "Yes, I am." And then he reached into his jacket and he pulled out a hammer. No one knows for sure why Alexander became a serial killer or why he almost exclusively targeted men. Many people believe it might have something to do with the brain damage he suffered as a 4-year-old when that swing hit him in the head, that somehow that rewired his brain and made him more aggressive towards other people, especially.
Sorry, I said the female. Not the male. I'm a liar.
Men. But that's just speculation. And other than that injury, there really isn't much in Alexander's life that stands out as a big red flag. He just kind of floated about his life and followed the crowd. But in 1992, when he was 18 years old, he got this urge to kill, and he actually decided to act on it. He brought up this desire to a classmate of his named Mikhail Odachuk, and surprisingly, Mikhail says to Alexander, "I want to kill someone too. Let's do it together." And so the two met up a couple of days later and they headed off to Bitsevsky Park and began walking around the forest looking for a lone person that could be their victim. And as they're walking along, Alexander, he's fully committed, but he can tell Mikhail is not. He's starting to get cold feet and he's talking about, maybe let's stop for now and head back and maybe do this another time. And Alexander, he's getting more and more angry and frustrated with Mikhail until finally Alexander decides, my first victim will be Mikhail. And so he turns to Mikhail and he says, "You know what? If you want to head back, you can." And Mikhail says, "Okay, maybe we can do this another time, right?" And Alexander says, "Sure." And so Mikhail turns around, and as soon as his back is to Alexander, Alexander pulls out his hammer and he smashes Mikhail in the back of the skull, causing Mikhail to crumple to the ground, either dead or unconscious. But either way, he's laying on the ground. And as soon as he is, Alexander remembers that they had passed a little while earlier this well kind of hidden in the middle of the forest. And so he grabbed Mikhail's body and he dragged him through the forest over to this well. And when he got to the well, he pulled the lid off of it, and then he picked Mikhail's body up, pushed him up and over the edge, and dropped him inside. And Mikhail fell 30 feet all the way down to the icy water below. And then Alexander put the lid back on the well, he grabbed his hammer off the ground, and he left. An important part of Alexander's killing was this well. This well was not a drinking water well. It was basically an access point to this deep underground sewer system that stretched all around the underside of this park. And so when Mikhail fell down this 30-foot shaft, he didn't just land at a pit of water right at the bottom of the well. Instead, he fell all the way down the shaft until it opened up like the bottom of a huge scientific beaker. It was basically like this big cave at the bottom of the well that was full of very deep water. And so Mikhail would have splashed into that water, which was icy cold, and then after Alexander put the lid on top of the well, it would have been pitch black inside of that space. Now, even if it had been lit up, there was no ladder for Mikhail to climb back out of. And there was a current running through this well because there were tunnels leading into it and then out the other side. And so Mikhail, if he woke up, if he was conscious when he hit the water, he would have immediately been swept into another tunnel. And many of the other tunnels that led away from this cave space were completely filled with water. And so he would have had nowhere to breathe. He would have been sucked into a tunnel and he would have drowned. And so whether Mikhail died from the strike on the back of the head or whether he drowned, we don't know. But he died after being thrown in the well. And then his body was swept miles and miles away to some deep underwater recess where nobody was looking. Alexander would wait another 9 years before he killed again. But once he started up again, he didn't stop. 9 years. His first kill after the hiatus was in the summer of 2001.
They should call him. They should take this seriously.
His victim was a man he liked to play chess with. In fact, this was a man that loved Alexander and was definitely one of Alexander's friends. They regularly played chess with each other.
No way he killed him.
And one day in May, after a game of chess, Alexander asked the man if he wanted to head into the forest to pay respects to his dog, who he had buried out in this forest. And he told the man he was going to have a sip of vodka over his dog's grave. And so this chess friend of his agrees to go with Alexander because he loves Alexander, he's a good friend of his, and says, absolutely, let's go pay our respects to your dog. And so the pair begin walking into the forest, and at first they're on a trail, but eventually Alexander says to this man that you need to leave the trail in order to get to the gravesite. So the man says, yeah, no problem. And so they get off the trail and they're walking for a little while until they reach the well. And when they get to the well, Alexander stops and he kind of points to some arbitrary spot on the ground and says, oh, that's where my dog was buried. And so Alexander pulls out a bottle of vodka and he takes a swig and then he hands it to the man, who does the same thing to kind of do this commemorative drink for this dog. And then afterwards, Alexander looks at his friend and kind of gestures with his arm to get the man to, take them back out of the forest, back out to the chess tables. And so the man turns around and begins backtracking.
Oh my God.
And as soon as he does, and his back is to Alexander, Alexander pulls out his hammer, he walks up behind his friend, and he smashes him over the back of the head. And then just like Mikhail, he drags this man's body over to the edge of the well, he pulls the lid of the well off, and then he lifts this man up, and he dumps him into the well shaft, and then he puts the lid back on top. Alexander continued to lure his victims out to that well, and all of his victims were people he knew. They were his chess friends. They were his neighbors in his apartment complex. They were anyone he had a personal relationship with. He would later say that that was his preferred victim. He liked to know the person he was killing. It made him feel like God. Amazingly, it would turn out not all of Alexander's victims who were chucked into that well actually died. Victims number 16 and 17, who were a pregnant woman and a 13-year-old boy respectively, after they had their heads smashed with a hammer and they they got chucked into the well, their clothing got caught on a snag poking out of the inside of that 30-foot shaft, and it literally arrested their fall and kept them from plummeting all the way into the water. And somehow, in both instances, Alexander didn't notice. He just put the well lid back on and walked away, believing they were both dead. But they weren't, and after they regained consciousness, they were able to kind of claw their way back up the well shaft and pulled themselves out of the well. Both victims would go to the police, and both of them would positively identify who their attacker was, Alexander. But the police didn't care. In fact, they told both of these victims that they needed to drop the charges and leave them alone. And if they didn't, they, the police, would come up with something to have both of them arrested, the victims. And so Alexander got away with it, and the victims were literally intimidated by the police to stay quiet. And so that led to dozens and dozens more murders. In April of 2006, after Alexander told Larissa he was the maniac and he was going to kill her, he walked behind her as she cried and continued to hold on to the tree, and he wound up his hammer and brought it smashing into the back of her head. And then as she slumped to the ground, he hit her several more times in the back of the head with the hammer, and then he pulled out a vodka bottle and he jammed it inside of the hole, and then he left. 2 months later, Alexander would lure another woman out into the middle of the forest with him. Her name was Marina. She was 35 years old, and she had met Alexander while working at the grocery store with him. She actually was hired to work at the grocery store to fill Larissa's now vacant spot. Before Alexander and Marina began their walk out to the park, which was Alexander's suggestion, Marina said she just needed to stop by her apartment to let her son know where she was going. And so they swung by her apartment. Marina went upstairs, and she
Please say
left
the
a
son
note for her
rescued the
teenage
lady.
son, saying where she was going and who she would be with, and she even left behind Alexander's name and his phone number on this note. And so when she came back out again and she and Alexander began walking towards the park, Alexander knew that if he killed her, which was his intention, that he would certainly be caught. The police were on super high alert at this point, and they would certainly get their hands on this note, and that would absolutely implicate him. And so he didn't really know what to do. But by the time they were strolling into the forest, Alexander had decided he was going to kill her anyways. And many people believe he did this specifically to get caught, not to protect the public from himself, but because he wanted fame. He wanted recognition for what he had done. This theory stems from the fact that starting with his 41st victim, Nikolai Zakharchenko, Alexander began leaving his victims' bodies out in the open. He stopped putting them into that well. And he wouldn't just leave them out in the open. He would prop them up in strange poses against trees, and he would jam glass bottles into the holes in the backs of their heads, indicating he wanted the police to find them. That way, he could get all the credit he believed he deserved. When the police did finally arrest Alexander, they searched his apartment and they found this notebook. And in this notebook was a picture of a chessboard. Now, a chessboard has 64 squares on it, and in Alexander's notebook, this chessboard had 62 of the 64 squares filled in. And Alexander would explain to police that that was his scorecard. He had 62 victims. It would turn out 2 of those people had actually survived, the pregnant woman and the 13-year-old boy, but still, there were 60 murders accounted for in this notebook. Alexander would be fully cooperative with police and would tell them every detail he could possibly remember about every single killing, including what conversations were like with the person he killed right before he killed them. He would also often reenact what he did to the person and how he felt afterwards. It was very clear that Alexander was reveling in the attention he was getting from law enforcement, and it was very clear that he loved talking about killing. Ultimately, the police were only able to gather enough evidence to charge Alexander with 49 murders, not 60. And when Alexander heard this, he was totally disappointed, and he asked the judge if he could get credit for the other 11 murders to maintain his 60 victim mark. The judge said no. During his trial, Alexander was deemed to be such a threat, he was kept inside of a glass cage the entire time. And during the proceedings, he showed no remorse, and in fact, seemed kind of happy, like he was enjoying the spectacle of his trial. He was ultimately given the harshest penalty under Russian law at the time, which was life in prison without parole, and the first 15 years of his life sentence would be in complete and total solitary confinement. So virtually no human interaction, kept inside of his cell 24 hours a day with nothing in his cell all day long. Alexander is still alive today, and he is still in solitary confinement. So that's going to do it, guys.
Wow.
If you got something out of today's episode,
you know what? It wasn't as brutal as I thought it was going to be. Like, the lady's leg got chopped off and shoved in a dog or whatever. Yeah, that was cringy. What's the comments say?
Speech on.
Let's read the comments.
Comments, 9.7K, Mr. Ballin is a force to be reckoned with. Not only was he a Navy SEAL, but he holds the power of the strange, dark, and mysterious in his hands, ellipsis, and he can pull off any flannel shirt.
Okay, let's do another one.
Action Men, 24 Men, top 3 scariest forest stories. Mix, Mr. 17 Men, the most inspiring Yandir Sim fan game. 36 Men, the Texas Cat Ladies House of Mr. Ballin, middle dot, today, Monday, Mr. Ballin, middle dot, today, verticals.
Guys, let's go on his channel.
0 comments, like this video along with collapse video. Close, button.
I can't believe I watched it.
Female uploads, Rush, the Texas Cat Ladies House of Horrors, 2.8 M
No.
views. Dead girl comes back to life, 1.9 M views. Middle dot 2 weeks ago. Female Hannibal Lecter given harshest sentence possible. Star Merch. He experienced the worst medical screw up ever. Star. The worst death story on the internet. 3.8 popular uploads. The worst death story on speech off.
Hey Dad, check it out. I've been learning the simple guitar and I already know how to play
Video player.
Please, what can you do
Install.
with three
Install.
chords? You know there's like a
Vi-
ton of
video play
songs
selected.
to play knowing all-
Speech
unless
off.
he was on the platform below. So there was
Okay.
Speech on. Learn more. Act 28. Influencers jump into pool of 27. Top 3 scariest true stories. Spooky story. Speech off.
Spooky.
Today's theme is very simple, scary stories. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please eat all of the like button's Oreos except for one and put it back in the pantry, and then also crumple all of their potato chips. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications
Really?
so you don't miss any of our weekly
eat my
uploads.
chips. I haven't
All right,
eaten
let's get into today's stories.
Scary stories. Okay, guys, today's gonna be 4 because there's 3 stories in here, so.
In 2010, an avid caver named Jeff decided to go to Madagascar to explore a natural cave shaft he had discovered years earlier. He arrived in country, he got a rental car, and he hired a guide to take him out to the area where he knew this cave was going to be. When he got out to that area, he used his notebook where he had taken notes the last time he was here, and he used that to find the opening to the cave. He paid the guide to stick around at the car while he went down and explored this cave. He assured him it was not going to be for a very long time. The shaft was approximately 50 meters deep and 1 meter across, so it's pretty narrow, and the first 20 meters of the descent are on a bit of an angle, and then the final 30 meters are down at a straight vertical drop. At the bottom of this cave was this opening where you could actually stand up and walk around, but there were no other tunnels to explore at the bottom, so you would just go down, touch the bottom, and go back up. The visibility inside of the shaft was limited because all you had was the light that was coming in, and because of how narrow the opening was, Jeff's body would obscure a lot of the sunlight coming in. So once Jeff got a few meters down into the tunnel, he would rely on his headlamp. So Jeff enters the cave and he makes his way down to the 20-meter mark. So that's where the tunnel goes from being on an angle to being straight. And he's about to make that final descent down that final 30 meters when he notices something out of the corner of his eye. And he focuses his light on the side of the shaft and he sees thousands of black widow spiders trying to escape the light. They're scattering
Oh my
all
God.
over the walls. And he looks around him and he realizes from his position down on the vertical section of the shaft is covered in black widow spiders. As much as Jeff wanted to stop right there and go right back up to the surface, he couldn't. In order to go back up this line that he was rappelling down on, he needed technical gear. And his technical gear was packed in his backpack, and it would just be totally unsafe trying to fish it out of his bag. and so he would have to descend the final 30 meters to the bottom, then take his pack off, get the gear out, and go back up. So Jeff took a deep breath, and he began his slow, awful descent into this cave filled with spiders. And periodically, as he would bump into the wall, he'd hear them scatter all over the walls, and then he saw them climbing on his sleeves, and he'd have to brush them off his sleeves. He saw them on the rope.
Guys, that's so creepy. I hate
He
spiders.
finally gets to the bottom, and he can hear the spiders on the wall just crawling all over the place. He takes his bag off, and it's covered in spiders. He opens it up, spiders crawl out of his bag. He carefully reaches in and pulls out his technical gear. He throws it up and he begins making his way back up. And the whole time he's just brushing spiders off of him. Once he gets to the surface, the first thing he does is he strips all of his clothing off to get all the spiders off of his clothing. He takes his bag, dumps it out, more spiders are in there. After he finally brushes all the spiders off, he redresses and gets in the car. And you can only imagine what the guide was thinking as he's watching this guy, this foreigner, taking his clothes off after being in this cave. But luckily, he doesn't get bit. He gets in the car with the guide, and they start heading back towards the city. As they're driving, he takes his notebook out, and he scratches off the title he had given this cave from the last time he was here, which was the Crooked Tube. He scratches that out, and on top of it, he writes, "The Entrance to Hell."
Video player. Heading. Video play. Video. Vertical scroll bar. Video player. Selected. Skip. Speech off.
In 2006, a 14-year-old boy
Speech
named
off.
Evan lived on a farm in North Carolina. This was not a typical farm with animals and crops. It was a pine tree harvestry. Pine needles are a big landscaping commodity, and Evan and his family made their living baling pine straw every year. As such, their main living house on the farm was situated right in the middle of 550 acres of perfectly lined up pine trees. They did not have any neighbors nearby, and there was only one road that led into the property, which from the main house, they could look out and basically see through the rows of trees all the way to the beginning of this road, which meant any visitors were really easy to spot. The main house was built on a very slight hill, which meant one side of the house was effectively built on stilts to compensate for the angle. And on that side of the house, on the first floor, was the living room. So anyone who was in the living room looking out the window, they basically need to look at a downward angle to see the ground. It would actually seem like you were on the second floor, but really you're on the first floor. The window in the living room was very unique. It stretched almost the entire length of the room, so almost 50 feet across. And at night, you could see animals darting between the different trees because you could see down the rows. And so that was pretty creepy. And then just the fact that this window is so big, if you're in the living room at night, you just felt really exposed. So between the creepy animals running around and the level of exposure and vulnerability, people basically avoided the living room anytime they were in the house at night. That winter, Evan's cousin came to stay with him on his farm, and because the main house did not have any extra bedrooms, Evan and his cousin would have to sleep in the living room. There were two couches inside of the living room, one that was right underneath the 50-foot-long window, and then another which was on the other side of the room against a wall that did not have a window. And so Evan would be sleeping on the couch right under the window, and his cousin would be sleeping on the other couch. The first night Evan's cousin was there, they put this big sheet up over the window, but it only blocked like 75% of the window. The two flanks of the window were still exposed, but where the couches were lined up, they were kind of blocked by this sheet, so it gave them a little bit of privacy. After goofing around for a while, the boys finally fell asleep around midnight, and then they woke up a couple hours later because they heard Evan's dogs barking way off in the pine trees. Now, Evan was used to his dogs running around the property and barking at other smaller animals, and so just them barking was not necessarily a red flag. But the barking persisted to the point where Evan's cousin got up off the couch, moved across the room to the opening of the window that was not covered by the sheet at the foot of where Evan was sleeping. Now, Evan was still laying on the couch. He was not going to get up and look out the window, so he's looking down at his cousin, kind of looking at his face to get some sort of a read on what he's seeing. And he notices his cousin has this really perplexed look on his face, like he's squinting his eyes and trying to make sense of what he's looking at. And so Evan looks at him and says, "Hey, what's going on? What do you see?" And his cousin's like, "I don't know if my mind's playing tricks on me or not, but I'm pretty sure I see people out there." At this, Evan jumps off the couch and runs over and butts up right next to his cousin so he can look out the window too. And he's scanning out amongst the rows of trees because there's just a mile of pine trees. And the first thing he notices is the moon is very bright that night. So there's good illumination, and there was a light snow covering on the ground, which really added to the illumination. He's looking out maybe 100 meters when he sees someone's leg extend from behind one of the pine trees as if they're stepping into the space between a pine tree column. And he's staring at it, and he can't believe he's even seeing anyone walking around this area because he didn't see anybody come in on the road, and they have no neighbors. And so he's looking, and then a body follows the leg. A person walks from one row to the next. This tall, dark figure just walks calm as can be between the two pine trees. And Evan just grabs his cousin, and he's like, "Did you just see that?" And his cousin's like, "Yeah, I saw that." And so they continue to look in the direction of where this person crossed the path. And after a couple of minutes, they see another leg now emerging, going the other way, back towards where that first person had come from. So the leg kind of extends into this gap, and this tall figure walks across into the next row, except now, instead of going just directly across, it looks like they're moving at an angle closer to the main house property. The boys look at each other and they don't know what to do, so they just keep looking out the window in stunned silence. And as they're looking, they see this person emerge again, except now they're not 100 meters away, they're like 20 meters away. They don't know how they were able to move that quickly without being seen. And this time when the leg comes out from behind the pine tree, instead of walking across the gap, it stops right in the middle, and it turns and looks directly at the boys in the window, and then begins running toward them. The boys practically fall over trying to get away from the window. Evan's yelling for his father upstairs, and the boys instinctively just start running around the house, locking every door, shutting every window. And as they're going from door to door, the anxiety is growing and growing because they think, if I don't get there fast enough, this person who was running towards the property is going to come barging through that door. And so at every door, their anxiety is through the roof, but they manage to shut everything. Everything is locked right as Evan's father comes charging down the stairs. He's got his gun in hand, and he's like, "What's going on?" And they say, "There's someone out in our property." Their dad charges out the front door. The front door is not on the same wall as the living room. It's on the side of the house. So once he goes outside, he's going to need to turn to the right to look out in the direction they were describing. He bombs outside, he stays on the porch, and he starts yelling at whoever's out there that if you come over here, I'm going to shoot you, get the F away from here. And then there's silence. And the boys are waiting, they're looking around, they're checking the window, they don't see anything. The dad comes back inside, he shut and locks the door, and he tells Evan, "Keep an eye out, if you see him again, you let me know." Evan would reflect on this experience later on and say, "You know, we really should have called 911 at that point, but as a kid, I just understood that that's the way my family did business. We kind of took care of ourselves. And so even though there is a threat of some stranger who's running at our property, we were not going to call the cops." And so his dad effectively was telling him to be a lookout. And so Evan and his cousin, they go back into the living room and they kind of go up to the window. They're a little bit apprehensive and they're looking out. And after 5-10 minutes of looking out the window and not seeing anything, they're thinking to themselves, you know, Evan's dad's a pretty intimidating guy, and he was just out there screaming and yelling with a gun, threatening to shoot them. So they probably got the message and they're probably gone. And so the boys got back into their couches.
Keep looking.
It took them a while, but they did ultimately fall
Keep
asleep.
looking.
The next morning when the boys got up, the first thing they wanted to do was go out there and see if they could find footprints from this person to kind of confirm it really was a person, because part of them thought, you know, maybe we didn't see that. Maybe that was our imaginations. They don't know. And so they start by going out the front door, so not on the same wall as the living room. They go out the front door, they turn and they walk down into the trees, and they're looking around and they find some footprints. So they're confirming to themselves, okay, there was someone out here. It wasn't us. This is not our footprints. We found them. So they start following the footprints back towards the property, and they realize at some point there are two distinct sets of footprints. There were two people out here. And even worse is they followed them all the way up to the house. And there were two different circles of footprints that stopped right underneath the living room window along the two flanks of the window where the sheet was not covering. Which means over the course of the night, when Evan and his cousin were up at that window looking out, there's a good chance that one or two strangers were tucked up against the side of the house. And they would not have seen them because of the angle out of the living room window. It was steep because of the stilts it was on. And so anybody that was tucked up along the side, they'd be in a blind spot. And then for sure, after Evan and his cousin got back into bed and were sleeping, there were two strangers who were right up against those windows, probably pulling themselves up to look inside. When Evan's father found these footprints, he immediately grabbed his gun and tried to follow them back into the woods to see where they came from, but unfortunately the snow cover wasn't complete, and at some point they lost the tracks and they never figured out who those two people were. Evan would say, following this event, his cousin refused to ever come back over his house for a sleep.
This is Andy. Thanks to Tinder's photo verification, you can feel confident that it's really him. But you don't know that he turns everything into a gym.
That's like it's by the woods too. I used to live, guys, if you don't know, I used to live in Louisiana, so I know how they feel because there's woods and there was rats under my bed and things.
Video play selected. Skip at speech
So I was
off.
creeped out a lot.
Sleepover. In October of 2005, a 21-year-old named Nathan was back home in Elk Grove, California, visiting his mother at her apartment for a couple of days. Her apartment was part of this really safe complex. It was gated, there's lots of lights and cameras, so anything that went bump in the night was just going to be, you know, your noisy neighbors or something. On the last night of Nathan's stay, he was laying in his bed in the guest room, listening to the hum of the street lamp that was outside, and the crickets and the passing by of cars when he drifted off to sleep. At about 2 a.m., Nathan woke up, or so he thought. He couldn't move his body, he could only move his eyes, and even though he had never experienced sleep paralysis before, he instinctively understood this is probably that. He noticed the room was completely silent. There was no more crickets, no more hum of the light outside, no more traffic.
Guys, just imagine you're paralyzed sleeping and then you just see someone walk in your room. Their faces looking scary as heck. They walk in your room and you're just laying down and your eyes turn to them. Oh my god, I can't imagine. That'll be a freaking nightmare.
Just total silence. And then he started flashing his eyes around the room because he couldn't move his head or his body, and he started taking stock of the room. The bed he was in was positioned as far away from the door as he could in the back right corner. From where he was laying, if he looked to his right...
What is happening? Stop! Okay.
In that corner was this big armoire, and then moving left from the armoire as he scanned the room, you come to the door, which is on the opposite side of where his bed was, and then if he kept scanning left, he would reach the foot of his bed, and just beyond the foot of his bed was a table and a chair. But because he was laying flat, he couldn't really look down and actually see the table and chair. And so with all of his strength, he managed to raise his head just enough that he had a line of sight to that section of his room, the only section he has not looked at yet. And he sees the table and chair, and he sees in the corner is this dark figure that's standing there looking at him. He's completely frozen with fear. His thought is, there's an intruder in the house. How did they get in here? What are they doing in here? And he managed to keep his head up just long enough to get a decent look at this dark figure, and he determined it was most likely a woman with a shawl covering her face. And before his head fell back to the pillow, he saw her suddenly crouch down on the ground out of view. And then Nathan's head fell back. And now he knows there's just some stranger in his room, and he can't lift his head up anymore, and he's looking around with his eyes. He sees the armoire, he sees the door, he can't see that table and chair, and then he hears the sound of someone slithering along the ground out of view, and he can hear her breathing as she's getting closer and closer to the edge of the bed. And he's laying there terrified. He's so scared he can't even make a sound. And he's telling himself, this has to be a dream. Wake up, wake up, wake up. And he's laying there, and this woman, she stands up and she leans out over his bed and she looks at him, and her face is pale and her eyes are sunk way back in her head. And then she begins to slowly crawl on top of him, and Nathan's sitting here looking at this woman. He wants to close his eyes, but he can't. And he just feels his chest being pressed down. He can hear the sounds of the springs compressing all around him as this woman positions herself on his chest. And then he finally manages to let out a scream, and then suddenly he's awake. The woman's gone. And he sits up and he's looking around. There's nobody in his room. The familiar hum of the light and the crickets and the traffic outside, they all return. And his mom comes running in the room, and she's like, "Hey, are you okay? I heard screaming in here." And he said, "Oh, no, I had a bad dream. I'm fine now. I had a terrible dream, but I'm fine now." And his mom's like, "Okay, all right, you need anything?" And he's like, "Nope, So she comes over, she gives him a hug and a kiss, she goes back to bed, and he would go downstairs, flip on a Disney movie, actually Aladdin, and he would fall asleep with a Disney movie on and with lights on. And there was no more sleep paralysis that night. The next day, Nathan got up and he headed back to his house, and he couldn't shake the experience. He had never had sleep paralysis before, but it was just so much more terrifying than he ever would have imagined. And he's just thinking to himself, I can't believe there are people that put up with this on any sort of regular basis. But, after a couple of days and getting home and not experiencing any sleep paralysis, time went on and he just kind of forgot about it. A few months later, in March of 2006, Nathan is at this big family party in Chico, California, big outdoor barbecue, all of his family's there, and at some point his sister shows up. His sister was not supposed to be attending this party, so it was a great surprise. He hasn't seen her in a while, and he immediately pulls her aside to catch up with her. And so for the first hour of their conversation, they're just chatting about their lives and what they're up to.
Okay.
At the end of their conversation, Nathan suddenly felt compelled to share his sleep paralysis experience with his sister. And the reason he wanted to was because he knew that she knew that he was actually a skeptic. And so she would believe him. If he's telling her this is what happened, she would believe that that's what he saw. And so he starts by saying, I had the weirdest experience at Mom's apartment just a couple of months ago. I'm pretty sure it was sleep paralysis. And his sister immediately butts in and she goes, wait a minute. I had sleep paralysis for the first time in my life 2 weeks ago at Mom's apartment. It was horrible. I was in the guest room and then I saw this woman and she was like standing on me. I thought I was gonna die. It was horrible. That's exactly what happened to me. I was laying in the guest room and I couldn't move, and then I saw a woman in the corner and she stood on my chest. They proceeded to go over all the details of each of their stories, and they discovered that they had had almost the exact same experience. And at the end of it, they wanted to have a rational explanation for how they both could just somehow have their...
Guys, I feel like that was not sleep paralysis at all. What if that was a real lady? I don't know.
only sleep paralysis experience in the same room in roughly the same timeline and experience the exact same events. They were trying to, come up with a rational explanation for that, but it was just too much of a coincidence. But ultimately, neither of them were really prepared to start discussing what else it could be. So they decided to just kind of laugh it off and say, man, that's pretty weird, and they moved on. After the party was over, Nathan would go back to his house and he would tell his wife about this crazy coincidence he and his sister had, and his wife would say, yeah, that's wild. But after that, Nathan just did not want to think about it or talk about it, and so he kind of just, pushed it out of his mental space and did forget about it. He moved on. 5 months later, in August of 2006, Nathan's mom would move out of that apartment building and she would move into a 2-story house still in Elk Grove, California. Shortly after she moved in, she asked Nathan if he would come spend a couple nights with her, and Nathan said sure. In order to better understand what happens to Nathan over the course of his stay at his mother's new house, you need to understand a basic layout of her house. So when you walk through her double doors, to your left is going to be a formal living room. In the center of the house is a hallway that shoots straight back to the kitchen. And then to your right when you walk in, there's a wall, and on that wall is the stairs leading up to the second floor. If you take those stairs to the second floor, you reach a landing where there's a window that looks back into the backyard, and immediately to your right, there is a single door, and that's the master bedroom where Nathan's mom would sleep. From the landing, if you turned left, there'd be another door that's a mirror image of the master bedroom door, and this door is the guest room. That's where Nathan was going to stay. And then to the left of the guest room was a hall that went to the front of the house, but that's irrelevant to the story. If you went inside the guest room, the bed was located in the back right corner, so the same layout as the guest room in the apartment building, where the person laying in the bed, so Nathan, his feet would be closest to the door. And from Nathan's perspective in the bed, the only other piece of furniture in this new house guest room was a table that was, from his perspective, on the right-hand wall, centered on the wall, and on the table was a TV. So that's the only things in the room. The first night Nathan was at this new house was totally uneventful. Second night, not so much. He was up in the guest room, laying on the bed, watching TV. The lights are off, it's just the TV on, and at some point, he dozes off. He wakes up a short time later, and he can't move. It's the same sensation he had when he was staying with his mom.
Oh my
at her
God,
apartment.
that's creepy.
And he begins to panic because the last time he felt this way, a strange veiled woman stood on his chest and made it feel like he was dying. And so immediately, he's trying to move his body, he can't, and so using his eyes, he starts looking around the room, praying this woman is not in the room with him. And so he looks to the right, to that corner, which he can see. There's no one there. From this corner, he starts scanning across the room. He sees the TV, it's still on. He keeps scanning and he sees the door and it's open. And then he scans and he's able to just barely make out the space at the foot of the bed. He can actually see to the corner, and this woman, she's not in here. And so initially he feels incredibly relieved that she's not in the room with him. But then he finds himself focusing on the open door into the dark hallway. And he's thinking to himself, please do not come walking through that door. And so he stares at the open door, just hoping he breaks out of this sleep paralysis, when he notices something about the TV. It's flickering. And so he averts his gaze to the TV, and he realizes what he's looking at on TV does not look familiar. It does not look like a TV show. It looks like CCTV camera footage. Like, it looks like a security camera footage. And he realizes the footage he's looking at is the inside of his mother's kitchen downstairs. He recognized the way it was laid out. That's his mother's house. That's downstairs. And he's staring at the footage thinking, why is this footage playing on the TV? And I don't think there's a camera down there. When he notices on the camera, the woman with the veil walks into the middle of the frame. And she looks up at the camera right as the camera turns off. And then the room is completely dark. There's no more ambient light in the room. The hallway is dark. And he's left paralyzed, knowing this woman is downstairs in the kitchen. And as he's laying there, he hears her start running through the house.
Oh
and
my
it sounds
God.
like an animal is barreling into things as she's running through the bottom floor, and she stops at the foot of the stairs. And he's thinking to himself, I know where she's going. She's coming up to my room. And so as he's laying there, he feels his heart racing and he's staring at the open door. He knows she's going to come flying up those stairs and she's going to come through that door. And instead of running up the stairs, he hears her take one step, two step. And as she's making her way up the stairs, he's just thinking, please break out of this trance. Stop this paralysis. Wake up, wake up. And then he sees her head emerge and she turns to look at him from the stairs into the room. And once she sees it's him, she bolts around and starts charging into the room on all fours like an animal. At this point, Nathan lets out a primal scream. He is scared for his life as this woman is charging towards him, and she stops dead in her tracks right in the middle of the room. She looks at him, turns around, and crashes out of the room, charges downstairs, and then it's silent. As soon as she was downstairs, Nathan could sit up. Except it did not feel like the first time he had sleep paralysis at his mom's apartment, when he sat up and he had the sensation of relief. You've woken up. You were asleep before. Now you're awake. This time, it was like he was always awake, but now he can sit up. He did not have a sense of relief. In fact, he was worried she was still in the house. And as he's sitting up in bed, his mother comes running into the room. She looks disheveled. She's half asleep. And she's like, was that you? Were you running around the house? I could have sworn I heard someone running around the house. Was that you? Nathan's looking at her and he can't even process what he's been through, whether that was real, whether it was a dream. And he's trying to find the words to describe to his mom the dream he had, but like he can't process what's happening. And he just says, Mom, we have to check the house. We have to make sure no one's in the house. And so the two of them flip on every light upstairs. They're not even talking. At this point, it's survival mode. They turn on all the lights upstairs, and Nathan leads the way down. They're flicking on all the lights, and they manage to search the whole house, and there's no sign of a break-in. There's no one in their house. After the coast was clear and they felt like they were not in immediate danger, they went into the kitchen to kind of talk about what just happened. And so Nathan's like, okay, Mom, I just got to tell you everything that I'm thinking right now. I can't really process what just happened. I think it was a bad dream, but I'm starting to think that it could be something else, or I'm just losing my mind. So a few months ago, I was sleeping in your guest room in your apartment, and I had an experience that I'm almost positive was sleep paralysis. You know, I was laying there, I couldn't move, and this figure was in the room and they were standing on me. It was terrifying, but it sounded an awful lot like sleep paralysis. But then a couple months after that, I talked to my sister and I told her about it. And she told me that very recently, right before you moved into this house actually, she was in that room and she also had basically the exact same experience. She had never had sleep paralysis before. I had never had sleep paralysis before. So we've basically had the exact same horrifying experience in the same room around the same time. And then just now, tonight, I had another sleep paralysis experience with the same woman who's running around the house, and you just said you heard her running around the house. His mom looked really concerned, but she wasn't shocked. She says to Nathan, I have seen this woman. I saw her in my apartment way long time ago. But I remember what you're describing. That's the experience I had. This woman, showed up in the room and she stood on me. And it scared the heck out of me, but I didn't tell anyone because I thought it was sleep paralysis. And so Nathan and his mom proceeded to spend the next several hours just talking through what this could be. How could they, all three of them, him, his mom, and his sister, how could all of them have had the exact same experience? And how could tonight, when Nathan had
because it's real.
This experience, how could his mom have heard those footsteps if that was indeed sleep paralysis? Because it wasn't Nathan, he was in the bedroom. And it wasn't his mom, she was in her bedroom. And she didn't have any pets, so who could it be? Nathan says he and his family are still totally rattled by this experience, and they don't have an answer. And this is a family of skeptics, so they're not looking for a reason to call this paranormal. They simply don't have the answers. Nathan has said that he, his mom, and his sister have not had any further experiences with the woman in black ever since that last experience Nathan had, and they're just hoping it stays that way. So that's gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments.
Guys, today was creepy. Next Monday I'll do this. But yeah, if you like this, don't miss out. Subscribe. It will be really fun. But I'll see you later, guys. I love you so much for joining.
Speed 1, 42. Blindfold screen 42 screen 42% 42 screen record screen 42% bet screen 42% screen recording in progress.
Thank you.
Button.
Sorry.
Status bar item.
Thank you for being here. Bye.